largest IPO in the history of financial markets just happened. SpaceX listed on the Nasdaq at over $1.7 trillion. Opening day has pushed that to nearly $2 trillion, and Elon Musk has just become the world's first trillionaire. And quietly sitting on SpaceX's balance sheet is nearly 19,000 Bitcoin, without a single ounce of gold to be found. That single event is simultaneously one of the most bullish things that has ever happened to Bitcoin long term, and one of the most bearish forces that is currently acting against Bitcoin's price right now. So here's the 4-layered pipeline that simplifies this entire situation. Firstly, SpaceX Bitcoin holdings, then the liquidity vacuum, then the Dotcom Parallel, and finally, the 4-year cycle. Let's get straight into this. SpaceX purchased 18,712 Bitcoin at an average price of approximately $35,000 per coin. The total cost was around $661 million, and at Bitcoin's current price, that position is worth $1.45 billion. That is more than a 100% return on a treasury allocation that most financial journalists are not even mentioning in their IPO coverage. SpaceX now ranks 8th among all public companies by Bitcoin holdings. Above it, you have names like MicroStrategy and a small handful of other Bitcoin holders that pretty much made treasury adoption their entire identity. SpaceX didn't make it their identity. They just quietly bought it, held it, and went public with it sitting on their books. Now here's what makes this historic. When the largest IPO ever recorded in the history of capital markets lists with Bitcoin on its balance sheet as a treasury reserve asset, it sends a message to every CFO, every institutional treasurer, and every sovereign wealth fund watching this listing that Bitcoin belongs on a balance sheet. MicroStrategy proved the concept, Tesla experimented with it, but SpaceX going public at $2 trillion while holding Bitcoin is a completely different level of validation. Not to mention that SpaceX holds 0 gold, so the long-term signal here could not be more bullish. And yet, Bitcoin is still struggling right now. So here's the reason behind that. Capital is not infinite, and every dollar that flows into SpaceX on its first day of trading is a dollar that has to come from somewhere. And where does institutional money come from when it needs to raise cash fast? The most liquid asset on Earth, which is Bitcoin. The AI IPO wave, including Anthropic and OpenAI, the $350 billion in equity supply hitting the markets, is in a compressed window. SpaceX is the centerpiece of that entire event. It is the single largest magnet for institutional capital in a generation. And Bitcoin, which trades 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, on every exchange on the planet, is the first thing you sell when you need dollars quickly. That data already shows this. The ETF outflows have run for 10 straight sessions. The Coinbase Premium Indicator, which tells you whether American institutions are net buyers or sellers of Bitcoin, has gone deeply negative. Bitcoin has been below the 80K resistance zone, with over 500 million in leveraged long positions getting liquidated in that range. That is not Bitcoin failing. That is Bitcoin being used as a piggy bank to fund the biggest equity event in history. But here's the Dotcom Parallel that should scare anyone still allocated heavily in this market. In March of 2000, at the absolute peak of the dot-com bubble, the most hyped IPO of the entire era hit the market. The Nasdaq topped that exact same month, and over the next 2 years, it crashed 78%. SpaceX is going public at over $2 trillion. It is the largest, most hyped listing in the history of financial markets. And it is listing on a NASDAQ that is sitting at or near its most overvalued levels ever recorded. All carried by an AI narrative that has added $19 trillion in market cap to the top 50 companies in 12 months. What history says is this: the largest, most hyped IPOs in the history of markets have a tendency to mark turning points. Not always immediately and not always cleanly, but the pattern of peak euphoria producing peak supply, which is exactly what an IPO is, at peak valuations is one of the most consistent patterns in the history of capital markets. If the equity markets turn, and they will turn the moment IPO supply overwhelms the demand holding them up, Bitcoin, which has historically led equity markets both to the downside and back out, will absorb that pressure first. Before the S&P cracks, before the NASDAQ rolls over, the smoke alarm that goes off is always Bitcoin. And now, when you look at the 4-year cycle, you see that everything is actually running exactly on schedule. Every prior cycle topped in the September through November window of year 3. This cycle topped at 124,000 roughly, exactly in that window. Every prior cycle bottomed in the September through October window of year 4. That window is approximately 3 months away. But here's the point. The SpaceX IPO is not an external disruption to that cycle. It is exactly a part of it. The liquidity vacuum it creates, pulling institutional dollars away from Bitcoin and into the largest equity offering in history, is the kind of macro event that has historically produced the final capitulation flush that marks a cycle low. Let's pull back from the short-term price action for a moment, because there is a longer signal here that is going to matter long after this IPO is done pricing and the dust settles. SpaceX bought 18,712 Bitcoin at $35,000 per coin. They held through multiple drawdowns, they held through the bear market, and they went public with that position intact, sitting on the books as a legitimate treasury asset of a company now valued at $2 trillion. That decision is going to be studied by every public company who has to justify why they are not doing the same thing. Michael Saylor and MicroStrategy opened that door, but SpaceX going public at $2 trillion with Bitcoin on the balance sheet doesn't just walk through the door, it builds a highway. The short-term panic is real. The long-term signal is historic, and that combination is one of the most asymmetric setups this asset has produced in years. The SpaceX IPO is not just a financial headline, it is a forcing function. The 4-year cycle clock says the bottom window opens in 3 months. The SpaceX IPO may be the event that pulls the trigger on it. Like and subscribe. Peace.